The Case of the Vanishing Vase. I never thought I'd be the kind of person to solve mysteries. Growing up, I was the quiet, bookish type, more interested in the stories I read than the ones happening around me. But somehow, life has a way of pushing you into unexpected roles. Now, as the part-time curator of Pinehurst Historical Museum and the unofficial sleuth of our small New England town, I've become accustomed to tracking down the odd disappearance or two. The museum is housed in an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, a cozy place filled with history and dusted and charm. It's the perfect backdrop for a quiet evening of local art, but it has its secrets. After all, who wouldn't want to explore hidden corners of a place that survived for over 100 years? Tonight, however, things were different. The Gala was buzzing with excitement. The museum had just opened a new exhibit called The Treasures of the Ancient World, and the star of the show was a rare Greek Amphora, an ancient vase supposedly owned by a famous philosopher. The whole town had been looking forward to it, and I was tasked with overseeing the event. I was standing by the buffet table, absent-mindedly adjusting the placement of a few hors d'oeuvres, when I noticed something was off. The guests at the gala were in high spirits, sipping champagne and admiring the exhibits. There was one glaring issue. The amphora, the centerpiece of tonight's exhibit, was gone. My heart skipped a beat. I looked around the room, hoping my eyes were deceiving me, but no. The pedestal that had been proudly holding the priceless artifact was empty. Panic spread like wildfire as I watched Edward Langston, the museum director, freeze at his sight. His face drained of color, and before I could say a word, the whisper started. "Where did it go?" someone gasped. "Is it stolen?" Edward rushed toward the pedestal, inspecting it as if the amphora might magically reappear. His voice quivered as he turned to me. "Cassandra, please, call the police." I raised my hand, cutting him off. "Not yet. Let's keep the situation under control. I'll handle this." I didn't wait for a response. I quickly moved to the guests, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. "Everyone, please," I called out. "We're just going to take a short break. Let's head to the dining hall for some refreshments while we sort this out." Once the guests were herded away, I shut the doors behind them. I turned to Edward. "Lock the doors. No one leaves until we figure this out." Edward didn't argue. I was an expert in keeping calm during a crisis. Something about the quiet of the museum and the weight of history around us always seemed to steady my nerves. I wasn't going to let panic ruin the evening. I started my investigation, of course. I'd always had a knack for solving puzzles, and the missing amphora was one mystery I couldn't ignore. It wasn't the first time something had gone wrong at Pinehurst Museum, but this felt different. I was sure this wasn't just a simple mistake or accident. Someone had taken the vase, and I was going to find out who. I quickly focused on 3 people who seemed to be acting oddly during the gala. Professor Harriet Winthrop, the renowned archaeologist who had been particularly vocal about criticizing the museum's security earlier in the evening. Maxwell Kane, a wealthy and somewhat shady art collector known for his expensive tastes and connections to the underworld of rare artifacts. Lucy Davenport, a young intern who kept her distance from the other guests, her eyes darting nervously as if she were waiting for something to go wrong. I started with Professor Winthrop. She was in the library, poring over notes for her next lecture when I found her. The professor was always an interesting character. Her sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude made her a difficult one to read, but I learned over the years that there was always a method to her madness. "I must say," she said coolly as I entered, "I was rather unimpressed with your choice of security for such a valuable piece." I nodded, pretending to pay attention, but my eyes were scanning the room. The floor was clean, but then I spotted something, a trace of mud on the professor's shoes. It was odd. The museum floors were pristine, and no one had been out in the garden since the event began. "I didn't realize you'd been outside," I said casually. Professor Winthrop stiffened. "I wasn't," she snapped. "I was in here the entire time. Perhaps the mud is from an earlier walk." I let her words linger, then moved on to Maxwell Kane. I found him in the dining room, sipping his drink with a grin plastered on his face as though nothing was amiss. Maxwell was the kind of person who always seemed to be in control, but something about his smugness tonight made me uneasy. "Everything all right?" I asked, my voice steady. Maxwell looked up, feigning surprise. Of course everything's fine. Why wouldn't it be? I didn't miss the nervous twitch of his eye. The man could lie with a smile, but his handkerchief caught my attention. The edge of it was torn, and it was stained with something I couldn't identify. I turned away to mask my suspicion, but the unease in his posture told me everything I needed to know. Then there was Lucy, the intern who hadn't spoken much all evening. I found her in the archives scanning old documents. She looked up at me and immediately seemed to shrink back. I was just looking for some files, she stammered. Is everything okay? Her nervousness was palpable. Something wasn't right. Lucy, I said gently, do you know where the amphora went? Her face flushed. I didn't see anything, she muttered, her eyes dropping to the floor. I didn't believe her for a second, but I didn't push her just yet. Instead, I gave her a few minutes before heading back to the exhibit. It was then that I saw it, the faintest trace of footprints leading to the garden. I followed them quietly, a growing sense of certainty filling me as I crossed the lawn, my boots crunching softly under the fresh snow. The footprints led to the shed behind the museum. It was locked, but I had a key. I opened the door and my heart skipped a beat. There, tucked under a tarp, was the amphora. But something wasn't right. The artifact was chipped, clearly damaged. And then it hit me. The amphora wasn't the real one. It was a replica. The real one had already been stolen. I was about to turn and head back inside when I saw something that made me stop cold. A pair of muddy boots. Boots that looked suspiciously like Professor Winthrop's. I sighed and headed back inside, my mind racing as I gathered the suspects in the dining hall. I couldn't wait any longer to bring this to light. The amphora that was stolen tonight, I said, voice cutting through the silence. It was a fake. Gasps filled the room, but I held my hand up to stop them. Maxwell Kane, you arranged for Lucy to switch the original with the replica. You blackmailed her, didn't you? You threatened her job here unless she helped you. Lucy's face crumpled, and before she could speak, Maxwell's eyes narrowed. You have no proof, but I cut him off. You left behind more than just a trail of footprints, Maxwell. You left your handkerchief, and the professor's muddy shoes led me right to the shed where you stashed the fake amphora. It's over. Maxwell's shoulders slumped, and Lucy burst into tears, shaking her head. I didn't want to, but he said he'd ruin my future. I sighed. I know, Lucy, I know, but you'll be all right now. Maxwell was apprehended, and the real amphora was soon recovered from its hiding place, a clever spot inside the library's antique globe where no one would think to look. As the gala finally wound down, I couldn't help but smile. A successful evening after all, I muttered to myself, heading toward the back office. A mystery solved, a thief caught, and maybe a lesson learned. Ultimately, the lesson is that integrity and honesty are the foundations of a strong, trustworthy community. And when faced with moral challenges, the right choice isn't always easiest, but it is the one that leads to personal growth and healing. And later, as the snow continued to fall outside, I sat at my desk writing down my findings. I could already see the story coming together. The case of the vanishing vase, another tale for the books.